In Shike Driz's 1969 poem, Mizel Meisel, a cocky Jewish mouse walks barefoot to Istanbul to buy a pair of whiskers. In Ovsei Driz's poem Turecki Dojdik, the 1973 Russian translation of Mizel Meisel by Gendrich Sapgir, a Turkish mouse undertakes a more elaborate journey, seeking, in addition to new facial hair, a fez and Turkish rolling tobacco. The problem of two different Drizes, Shike, the Yiddish poet, and Ovsei, the Russian one, published predominantly for children, has been discussed by scholars who have linguistic access to Driz's Yiddish and by Driz's Russian-speaking contemporaries, many of whom did not. Recent memoirs and scholarship have duly questioned the image of Dries in the 1960s promoted by subversive artists like Moscow conceptualist Viktor Pivovarov and by unsubversive writers like Lev Ozerov. In Pivovarov's memoirs, Dries remains the, quote, beloved, disheveled, slapdash, tipsy, ebulliently lyrical embodiment of the poet, unquote, who was transformed and even invented in Russian by poet Sapgir, his friend and most prolific translator. Ozerov suggested that Driz's name was an acrostic composed of Детство, Радость и Здоровье. As Valery Dimshitz observes, both packaged Dries into a, quote, kindly, naive storyteller, chudak, a man not of this world, end quote. This scholarship exposes the differences between Sapgir's Russian representations of Ovsei Dris and Shike Driz's Yiddish originals. It emphasizes the loss of idiom and the loss of the entire world of early Soviet avant-garde Yiddish poetry that Sapgir's translation and this image of Dries have permitted. Indeed, backed by the ambiguous status of Yiddish in a cultural hierarchy of world and Soviet languages, the image of Dries, the Russian poet, in the Russian imagination of the 1960s seems located somewhere between the mythically august and illiterate balladeer like Jambul Jabayev and the mythically bottle-loving wordsmith like Welsh poet Dylan Thomas, but with the kindness and sensitivity to childhood of Samuel Marshak. In this paper, I aim to build upon recent scholarship by suggesting that Dries understood his creative circumstances and made use of the possibilities that they opened up, both in Russian and in Yiddish. By playing with notions of Jewishness and responding to the fantasies of his era, Dries fashioned a semi-counterculture hero that could delight, strike, play to, and sometimes just play multiple audiences at once. I posit that Dries was able to engage these audiences by practicing a post-war version of what scholar Seth Wolitz calls Marinism. Wolitz examines the idiomatic Verdrehter Kopf, or upside down and maybe a little crazy head, in Marc Chagall's 3:30 in the Morning, the poet, which was obvious to those who knew who knew Yiddish, and radically experimental to artists who did not. Wolitz argues that Chagall, quote, learned from Cubism the power of simultaneity and adapted its system in art to that of a Murano living and functioning in two different existences at the same time. His art sends one message to the general public and another to Jews who spoke his language, end quote. Dries moved in simultaneous, imbricated, and overlapping late Soviet worlds, composed at the very least of Yiddish speakers, non-Yiddish speaking Jews, and Russian artists, family members, and children. His was a multiplied Marinism that befit a readership that could not be split down the middle between Jews and non-Jews. It belonged to an era of late modernism in which Dries could draw on a corpus of cosmopolitan Yiddish poetry whose internal idioms, recast by Dries, would be read as original by all but an intimate circle of Yiddish writers. Dries created his simultaneous worlds by tinkering with and building upon elements of Yiddish modernism, Soviet children's poetry, and the late Soviet ragtag poet intellectual. In speaking to multiple audiences in originals and in translations, Dries crafted a Yiddish idiom aimed at a small audience of Svoi that succeeded as a style of speech far beyond it. I now turn to the poem Mizel Meisel. By drawing attention to poems by Eliezer Steenbarg, 1881 to 1932, and by Itzik Monger, 1901 to 1969, to which Driz's Yiddish original possibly gestures, I show how Dries repurposed elements of the Yiddish tradition to contribute to the authority of the gray-haired, tipsy, and ebulliently lyrical poet in Russian in the 1960s, and to admit the losses that stood behind that poet. First, I will read Shike Driz's original, published in a volume of his verse edited by Yiddish singer Lebu Levin and published by Sovetский писатель. I offer my and Valery Dimshitz's word-by-word translations in your handouts. I have left the title as is, since I have discovered that it recalls mice invented by Steenbarg and Monger, both self-styled folk poets associated with Czernowitz. In Yiddish critic Shmuel Niger's estimation, Steenbarg wrote fables for, quote, intellectually aware adults, not for children, for the intelligentsia, not for the simple folk, end quote. Monger is best known for his playful remakes of Bible stories. David Roskis calls him a, quote, modernist folk bard, divinely inspired prankster, and consummate poet of exile and homecoming, end quote. I will discuss Steenbarg's and Monger's mice in turn, but now I turn your attention to Driz's poem. Zi emes, zi nein, kon ich nicht schweren, nor mir hot der Zelt an alter Lamtern, als Reb Misele Meisel vermogt hot in Keschene, efscher a dritthalben groschelech Meschene. Von deswegen hot bestimmt verachtogen, a viele dem Weib und die Kinder nicht sogen, versetzen die Schich und a Burwasser läufen, sich türkische Wohnses in Stambul zu kaufen. Nur Stambul ist nebach gestanden verschlossen, a türkischer Regen hot dorten gegossen. Dries creates his mouse out of words from a modern fable included in Steenbarg's popular collection Mesholim, 1932, called Der Bal Yoetz, or The Advisor. In Steenbarg's fable, a certain Reb Meisel argues before 10 minions of his peers that only by cutting or biting off the ends of their tails can the mice break the cycle of hatred, sine, out of envy, kine, directed at them and their long tails by a local tomcat. Once their tails are taken down to size, his theory goes, the cat will no longer hate them, ushering in an era of peace so complete that they will lick butter from a cat's open mouth. When the question of who should perform this act of purifying violence arises, one wise old mouse proposes that they flatter the cat by asking him to do the honor of biting. Before the mice weeping at their fate, the fabulist steps in and warns, Och und weh, a cat hates a mouse, even a snipped one. The name of Driz's Mizel Meisel is embedded in the story's moral. Mizel Meisel Mois, may your tail be large, may it even be small. The tomcat remains a tomcat, and his little teeth, teeth. In 1942, the fabulous rhyme became the refrain of a poem by Itzik Monger. Monger's poem is the epilogue to his collection Clouds Over the Roof, published while Monger was marooned in London. With these words, Monger begins a poem in which the poet declares his song is dead. Mizel Meisel Mois, my lied is ois, or my poem has passed away, so that Mizel and Meisel become the farewell gesture of a folk poet and piper who leads Steenbarg's mice away by means of his song. In the end, he goes out whistling. Mizel Meisel Mois and cat without a tail, I whistle my last niggin and leave happily. Both Steenbarg's and Monger's narrators are as cheeky as they are tragic. Steenbarg's fabulist offers an Aesopian moral about the unchangeable nature of human interaction that is loaded with Hebraisms and double entendres about Jewish manhood. Monger's poet announces his exit by playing with the meanings of pfeifen as to whistle and pfeifen off as to heck with. He impishly says heck with his interlocutor's groschen in the first stanza, and then whistles his final tune in the last, echoing his earlier aloofness. Driz's Missel Meisel conjures up Steinbock's and possibly Manger's mice in Moscow in 1969 to name a hero whose story, passed on by a potentially unreliable old lantern, the poet cannot swear to be real. I, for my part, cannot swear his intertextual references to be real. But it seems likely that Dries knew Steinbock's popular fables, and we know that he had access to at least some of Manger's work through his previously mentioned friend and editor, Leibu Levin, who performed poems from Clouds Over the Roof in the 1960s in Moscow. At this juncture in the history of Soviet Yiddish literature, the leaders of Yiddish literary culture of the 1920s and 30s, Leib Kvitko, David Bergoson, Peretz Markish, and others, were all more than 15 years dead. The suggestion of inexorable violence against Jews in Steinbock's address Missel Meisel Mois, already tragic in 1932 and 1942, should sound all the more plangent and lonely as a truncated echo in Driz's 1969 poem. However, in keeping with a style shared by many Yiddish modernist writers, Dries incorporates his awareness of downfall in a poem that is balanced on the tipping point between playfulness and absurdity. He keeps the deaths of poets and the partial failures of modern literature in view, chewing over these ends and thematizing them. In so doing, he develops a strand of post-1917 writing that was vibrant and novel precisely because writers like Steinbock and Manger came up with new approaches to describing violence and utopian dreams gone bust. One of these approaches, and one that the progressive disappearance of autonomous Yiddish literary culture made possible, was the very act of infusing poems with references that are bound to fail. Poets like Dries then bound them up with poems that are stylistically so marvelous that unprepared readers such as Pivovarov, who said, "Nikto iz nas ne znает, kakov Dries na Yiddish," are none the wiser. While Dries may have anticipated that a few people would pick up on his references, and dedications to contemporaries imply that he was indeed speaking to them, his fellow poets composed a fraction of his audience. His verse was also intended to entertain, comfort, and educate Soviet children in Russian, and he often performed his poems for friends and translators who did not speak Yiddish. He could not have expected children, or most translators, to appreciate his recycling of nonsensical mice from poems by Romanian Yiddish poets. Much of the content of Driz's poem is, I argue, unknowable to the interloper by design. The poem succeeds anyway because readers remember its masterful style and the comedy of the mouse, stymied in his attempt to get new whiskers in Istanbul. In this way, Dries used the Yiddish tradition to create a reserve of private language, and, learning from poets such as Steinbock and Manger, he created a playful style that could be detached from that very tradition. Dries was not alone among post-war poets in using a little-known language for late modern purposes. Scholar Barry McCrae has analyzed the use of Irish and dialects of French and Italian to show how, as these languages, quote, fell out of wide-spoken use or threatened to do so, they became associated with a lost, unrecoverable, intimate relationship to language itself, end quote. Their gradual disappearance, or the fear of their disappearance, quote, lent them an imaginative power for modernist literature, so permitting poets to employ dwindling vernaculars as a private language of poetry, end quote. Dries differs from these poets, however, in allowing, and perhaps even intending, his private language to be lost on children with different linguistic needs and frames of reference, and further, in fashioning a new kind of creative intimacy with readers, translators, and the late Soviet period itself, through the very translations that made his private language invisible. In the final part of this talk, I turned to Sapgir's Russian translation to discuss how Driz's Yiddish gave Sapgir a kind of leading original with which to write a Russian version that could stand alone. Турецкий мышонок, веселый бедняк, нашел возле дома турецкий пятак. Мышонок находку в платок завернул и побежал по дороге в Стамбул. Хотел он купить турецкий пятак, турецкую феску, турецкий табак и пару красивых турецких усов в турецкой лавчонке у старых часов. Но дождик турецкий в Стамбуле идет, мышонок дрожит у турецких ворот, а стражник усатый ему говорит, по случаю дождика город закрыт. Here, instead of Reb Mizle Meisel, Soviet readers got a Turkish, pointedly Southern, and undeniably late Soviet mouse. He tries to use a comic Turkish 5 kopek coin to improve his style by acquiring a fez, smoking Turkish tobacco, and applying what Pivovarov's illustration suggests to be a new set of enviably long and fine-tuned ethnic facial hair. As Dymshitz cleverly notes, наконец, это наш советский мышонок, веселый бедняк, классово, так сказать, близкий. While Sapgir amplifies the qualities of the affable and offhandedly industrious bednyak in Driz's mouse, I submit that the original invites his choices in view of Russian literary atmosphere in the late Soviet Union. If Soviet myth cast the Yiddish poet as a hybrid native bard, European poet, humorous children's rhymester, and this myth informed Pivovarov's idea of Driz's disheveled and tipsy demeanor and ebullient lyricism, then this particular image of the Yiddish poet proved compatible with the devil-may-care virtuosity that was gaining authority in semi-counterculture thinking on poetry in general in the late 1960s. The popularity of this style can be discerned in Vladimir Vysotsky's rough-and-tumble voice and in the depiction of Pushkin as a lazy-bones, boyish prankster and flirt in Andrei Sinyavsky's Прогулки с Pushkinim. Sinyavsky published Прогулки under the assumed name of Abram Terz, a fictional Jewish gangster from a Southern folk song who seemed pre-equipped to embody and authenticate literary fantasies of the 1960s. Like Isaac Bashevis Singer in America, but with different aesthetic experiments, audiences, and perhaps kinds of fame in mind, Dries turned local fantasies of Jewishness to his artistic advantage. Thus, Dries uses Yiddish to lead Sapgir into accentuating the likeness between the mythical Soviet Jewish poet and what I have been calling the ragtag poet intellectual. In the 1969 original, Reb Mizle Meisel is already the child-sized co-evil of counterculture heroes such as Venya Yerofeev, the narrator of Venedikt Yerofeev's comic and tragic Moskva Petushki, written in 1969 to 1970. Both Driz's original mouse and Yerofeev's hero are given to flights of fancy that result in ill-clad journeys on tight budgets to fantasy cities they will never reach, as they end their quests in physical suffering rather than fulfillment. Both poems are labyrinths of literary references that few readers could catch. Their authors create, as I have argued, a reserve of private and even tender literary associations while accepting their loss on a wider public. Dries and Yerofeev craft works that are so tight and masterful, often by means of artistic strategies invented by the very dead poets to whom they gesture, that readers can more than make do without these associations. But while Venya was an underground icon whose speech is rife with cultural and linguistic taboos, Driz's form of wordplay was celebrated by official journals in both Yiddish and Russian. Hundreds of thousands of copies of Turecki Dojdik were published in the Soviet Union. Driz's poems were set to music and included on school reading lists. His intertextuality, however, was more hidden and elite than Yerofeev's. Writers like Gorky, Turgenev, and Pushkin are Yerofeev's most prominent targets and arguably open to any Russian reader with a library card ready to decipher them. Dries, as I have shown, refers to Yiddish writers who are only within reach of a cadre of Yiddish speakers with the intellectual and physical resources needed to access Yiddish modernism. In summary, I have suggested that Driz's language forges a post-war, post-1952 form of Marianism. It is, on one level, a private and expressly Jewish language. Yiddish's status as a dwindling vernacular with a highly developed modern poetic tradition made it uniquely capable of articulating a late century sense of loss and irretrievability. On another level, the circumstances of Soviet translation and interest in heroes like Monger's Piper and Steinbarg's Fabulist permitted modernist Yiddish literary strategies to be transferred into Russian. As with Chagall's Fardrater Cope, these strategies delighted readers who loved the traces of Yiddish that surfaced in Russian, although they often could not identify them genealogically. Like Isaac Bashevis Singer, Dries worked all the levels of the language he invented at the same time. Dries was not an innocent bystander to the creation of his image or the adaptations of his poems for a Russian-speaking audience. He carefully maintained a semi-secret world that Russian versions kept from view. Dries's Marinism thus exposes the surprising similarity between the creative agency available to Yiddish writers in America and in the Soviet Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for very, very interesting presentation. Even especially for me personally, because I met Shika.
Oh.
And I'm witness that he was admired by the circle of avant-garde poets like Igor Kholin, or like Jan Satunovsky, not only Sabgir. And thank you that you kept. Dear colleagues, some questions, commentaries. Please.
Можно по-русски, да?
Да, можно.
У меня вопрос такой. Это очень здорово, интересно, мне очень нравятся эти скрытые layers, так сказать, да, вот эти вот, которые. Но это уникально или что кто-то еще есть? Вот в ваших раскопках нашлись какие-то еще ли имена, кроме Дриза, вот с такими вот скрытыми?
В смысле, другие поэты, которые так
Другие
делают?
поэты, другие писатели, еврейские, я имею в виду, а может быть и не еврейские. Да.
Но это в основном тема моей диссертации. И это является первой главой. А вообще, я думаю, что можно, но у Высоцкого даже. Но у Высоцкого это более очевидно, потому что у него есть там прямые такие идишские слова. И придумал ли он эту песню или нет, когда смотрим на Высоцкого, на фильмы Ильфа Петрова, но потому что я смотрю на 60-е годы, и поэтому я больше всего смотрю на фильмы, которые, по мотивам «12 стульев», не только у Дриза. Дриз — это очень хорошее место, где начать, по-моему, потому что мы знаем, что это все сначала на идише, да, и поэтому можно доказать, что вот, был такой на идиш, и потом вот это мы можем, следить за этими слоями и найти, как они попали в русский. Это еще сложнее, когда мы говорим о авторах, которые в основном писали по-русски, и более спорно, я считаю. А у Дриза это везде, это не только в этом стихотворении, но много где, и это хорошая тема.
You made an interesting point about the Munger connection. Certainly, Abel Levin would be one link. But it's interesting to look at the obituary of Munger written by Yankiv Sternberg, in which he argues that Munger's tradition is actually alive only in the Soviet literature, that they are real heirs to that tradition. And I don't know if you look at Sternberg's poetry and to what extent, well, there's certainly this Chernev's group of Altman, Moshe Altman and Sternberg, but I'm wondering to what were the kind of relationship between them and Dries?
Between Sternberg,
no, Yankiv Sternberg, the Soviet Yiddish poet.
I must admit, I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
But I look forward to researching that more.
So I think it's 1965 in Soviet Heimland. There was a very sort of, I wouldn't say enthusiastic, not the right word, but very warm and long obituary of Munger written by his close associate, by Yankiv Sternberg from
Well, thank you very much for bringing my attention to that, because, there are many mice in literature in the 20th century, and to make the argument, especially since Munger was not always published in the Soviet Union, is not easy. And so that really helps my case to hear that he was in Soviet Homeland, he was being discussed and was just accessible to writers of that era.
Not accessible, but
Yeah.
he was.
Yeah, discussed. Yeah. If we have one more second, I wanted to put my thank yous to the end to make sure I fit in with 20 minutes, but I just wanted to thank the organizers for allowing me also to be on a panel with scholars whose research has been very influential in mine. So thank you all for that.
Thank you. Thank you.